At El Wad Cave, on the slopes of Mount Carmel in modern Israel, families had been sheltering inside the same limestone rock shelter for thousands of years, generation folding into generation, without much reason to look elsewhere. Hearths stacked on hearths in the same corner of the same cave. Then, sometime after roughly 12,500 BCE, at a spring-fed site called Eynan-Mallaha, barely a day's walk away, some of those same broader communities started digging circular pits into the open ground, lining them with stone, and staying year after year in a place with no rock ceiling at all overhead. For most of human history, whenever caves were genuinely available and useful, people simply kept using them, generation after generation, without much reason to stop on principle or out of embarrassment. So, what actually broke that pattern? In one of the best documented cases of exactly this transition anywhere on Earth, down to individual storage pits and dental records, archaeologist Dorothy Garrod excavated El Wad and several neighboring caves on Mount Carmel, starting in the 1920s, uncovering layer after layer of hearths, tools, and burials packed into the same shelter across an immense span of time. That work eventually defined an entire archaeological culture. The Natufians, hunter-gatherers who occupied the Levant roughly between 13,000 and 9,500 BCE. For thousands of years before any of this shifted, caves and rock shelters like El Wad were a completely reasonable long-term strategy, offering shade, defense, and dry shelter with essentially zero construction effort required to move in. Then, starting around 12,500 BCE, archaeologist Jean Perrot began excavating a very different kind of site at Eynan-Mallaha, also known as Eynan, in Israel's Upper Jordan Valley. What he found there overturned the standard assumption about exactly when settled village life first began, an assumption most researchers at the time had confidently pinned to the much later invention of farming. Circular, stone-reinforced huts, some as large as 7 meters across, arranged around a permanent freshwater spring, along with storage pits, a reused cemetery, and clear evidence of repeated, continuous rebuilding on the exact same footprints for centuries running. This wasn't a seasonal stopover site people passed through once or twice on the way somewhere else. It was one of the earliest known permanent villages anywhere in the entire archaeological record, and it was built completely in the open, with no rock shelter anywhere in sight for anyone to fall back on. So the cave didn't get abandoned because it suddenly stopped working as shelter. Nothing about El Wad itself got worse. Something else made the open ground next to one particular spring worth all the extra effort of building an entire settlement from scratch. The leading environmental suspect is the younger Dryas, an abrupt cooling and drying event that gripped the northern hemisphere starting around 12,900 years ago and lasted roughly 1,200 years. Archaeologist Donald Henry has argued the shift pushed Levantine plant and animal resources into tighter, far more predictable clusters around reliable water sources. Exactly the kind of pressure that would make permanently settling beside one dependable spring considerably more valuable than continuing to roam between scattered caves whose surrounding food supply had grown thinner and less certain. Dental ware recorded on Natufian remains from this period does show measurable dietary stress consistent with harder, more marginal food sources during exactly this narrow window of time, evidence of jaws working overtime on tougher, less forgiving plants. Here's the twist worth not skating past, rather than tying this up too neatly for the sake of a cleaner ending. At Eynan-Mallaha specifically, the flagship site most closely tied to this entire story, and the one every textbook reaches for first, a 2025 reassessment of 70 years of accumulated excavation data found no convincing evidence that the younger Dryas actually disrupted occupation there at all. The climate story checks out at other sites scattered across the region. At the single settlement most often used to illustrate it, the timing simply doesn't fully cooperate with the theory. So if climate alone doesn't close the case at the site that matters most, what does the rest of the evidence at Eynan-Mallaha actually suggest instead, once the weather gets ruled out as the sole explanation? Storage pits, dug deep enough to hold food through a lean season, the Natufian equivalent of a fully stocked pantry nobody wanted to abandon halfway through winter. Grinding stones, worn smooth from processing wild cereals, collected nearby. A cemetery, reused deliberately across generations, anchoring specific families to specific ground through their own buried dead, rather than through any single dramatic event. None of that required a shifting climate to make sense on its own. It required a spring reliable enough and food sources concentrated enough that staying in one place and defending a claim to both finally started beating the old strategy of moving on whenever a cave felt used up. The cave itself had never really been the limiting factor. Predictable, defensible resources were. So here's the real shape of it, once the pieces sit together properly rather than collapsing into a single tidy cause. Caves like El Wad didn't fail Natufian families in any structural sense, and nobody woke up one morning newly embarrassed by living under a rock ceiling their parents had also used. A specific, spring-fed patch of open ground at a specific historical moment when food and water both became genuinely worth defending in one fixed place, simply started quietly outperforming a cave that had worked perfectly well for thousands of years before it. Climate almost certainly tightened the squeeze somewhere in the regional background, narrowing the margins everywhere at roughly the same time. The archaeology sitting closest to the actual village, though, suggests the villagers themselves ultimately made the final call, spring by spring, harvest by harvest, storage pit by storage pit. Thousands of years of families cycling through the exact same limestone shelter on Mount Carmel, one dry season after another. One generation's hearth ash layered directly over the last. One reliable spring in the Jordan Valley, and huts rebuilt on the same footprint for centuries afterward, right beside it, long after the people who dug the first pit were gone. A climate event that explains the wider region convincingly and still can't fully explain the one village that ended up mattering most to the entire story of settled life. The cave was never really the problem being solved here. The spring, it turns out, was simply the better answer,